Have you ever wondered how your office space is actually being used? If you knew, could you optimize or even reduce your real estate? Get to know Occupancy, the only infinitely scalable, instantly deployable, privacy-first occupancy measuring solution that shows you what's going on so you can stop guessing and start knowing. This simple plug-and-play format requires zero infrastructure changes. Easily capture reliable data to optimize space allocation and design, improve employee experience, and reduce costly unused spaces. Occupancy can measure utilization for a single office floor or across your entire real estate portfolio. Your data is always accessible. With a glance at your dashboard, through digital signage or seamlessly integrated to any third-party platform via API. Occupancy, the simplest, most cost-effective way to stop guessing and start knowing.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and watching that video while we let everyone trickle in here. I'm very excited to be talking about deploying occupancy data sensors across higher ed office space today. We've got a great panel of folks here. We've got one person who is running a little bit late. We'll be jumping on shortly, but why don't we get it kicked off with running around the horn with introductions. I am Nick Halverson, CEO, founder of Occupancy. Sarah, why don't you jump in next, and then Keith and Chris, you guys can introduce yourselves.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Sarah Rogstad. I'm the head of accounts here at Occupancy.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon on my end here in Virginia. I'm Keith Hayes. I'm the Director of Space Management for Virginia Commonwealth University.
All right, Chris Moret. I'm the president of Cohere Campus and Workplace, which is a strategic space planning and space activation consultancy. And before that, I was at Rutgers University for 10 years as the director of scheduling and space management. So Keith and I are former brethren, but still going to have a good conversation today.
Perfect. And our last panelist will be joining us here in a minute is Eliud Escobedo. He's the Chief Process Officer at UC San Diego, overseeing the real estate and space planning departments over there. Before we jump in, the majority of this conversation is going to be a great discussion with Keith, Eliud, and Chris kind of moderating that discussion. We really wanted to get a couple different perspectives from clients of Occupancy who are at different stages in the journey of deploying occupancy data sensors across office space. And so I'm excited for that discussion. But before we get to that, I want to level set a little bit about what is occupancy data, what are people using this data for, and who is Occupancy, and how did we get here as well. And so I'll start with just what is occupancy data, or utilization data as it's sometimes also called. And that's really just data on how a space is actually being used. A lot of us, we know we have data on how many people are allocated to work in a space. Hey, Eliud, how you doing? Hello. We just did introductions. Why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thanks so much. Eliud Escobedo over University of California, San Diego, and my role is Chief Business Process Officer.
Awesome. Sounds good. So I'm level setting a little bit about what is occupancy data, what are the top use cases, a little bit about Occupancy, and then we'll spend the majority of the time with a great discussion with you, Keith, and Chris. So occupancy data is how people actually use a space. A lot of times you know how many people are allocated to be in an office space, but you don't know how many people are actually showing up every day using that space throughout the day. And so that's the data that Occupancy and other vendors do provide in the space. It's really the difference between allocated people and actual usage can be a pretty big delta a lot of times, and there can be a lot of value in that. And that takes us into the use cases. Occupancy was born in higher education. We started actually in student spaces, libraries, gyms, dining halls. The main use case is showing students how busy these spaces are in real time. And then quickly now we've moved into office space. Most of our business is in higher education office space. We work with over 70 universities across the country. And the number one use case for our data is really trying to optimize space utilization in your office space and ideally be more efficient with the office space that universities and corporations have. Tactically, that looks a lot of the time like going from assigned desks to unassigned desks, going from one-to-one employee to desk ratios to sharing desk ratios. So a department might have 30 people, but maybe only 10 people show up every day with a peak of 15 people. They probably don't need 30 desks. And so doing that across a lot of departments in a university can free up a lot of real estate, reduce massive costs for the university so they don't have to build new offices, or maybe they can shrink their portfolio in some cases. That's the biggest use case of our data, is really getting more data driven with real estate space allocation. But we also are seeing other use cases, such as getting on the operational expense side of buildings, being able to reduce energy consumption through HVAC integrations and demand control ventilation, optimizing the cleaning of spaces with custodial cleaning integrations, cleaning spaces based on how they're actually used, rather than just cleaning all the spaces every day. And then finally, even cafeteria food waste. We're seeing this is a little bit more on the corporate side of our customer base, but corporations that have a cafeteria in their building, we're helping them project how many people come to lunch, and they're reducing their food waste by 60% or more, which is a really exciting use case. So that's some of the top use cases. There's certainly some other use cases for our data, but I'm going to give you the quick 1-minute pitch on how OccuSpace got started, and then I'll hand it over to Chris, Keith, and Eliuth. I started OccuSpace when I was a junior electrical engineering student at UC San Diego. My co-founder was a master's in machine learning. We simply just hated how crowded the library was on campus, and we wanted an app that would tell us how busy is every floor of the library before we came, so we don't have to waste time looking for a seat. We built a sensor that looks like this. You plug it right into an outlet. It covers about 2,000 square feet of space. It measures the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi signal data in the area, and we get to a people estimation with about 93% accuracy on average. We made this app that students could download for free. It became a big hit at UC San Diego, where then Eliuth and some folks from his team took note of it and saw that there could be value in other spaces on campus. But I want to emphasize that starting this as a student for spaces I was visiting and being in the higher ed space from day one forced us to focus on what's important in higher education. And first and foremost, that's privacy. Our solution uses no personally identifiable information from start to finish, from storage to use in our algorithms and calculating people. We're not seeing who is in a space, just how many people are in a large area. And I think that's really important, especially as we get into the office space side of things, but even in the student space side of things. And so our solution's been designed for higher ed from day one, and with privacy in mind. And so with that, why don't I throw it over to you, Chris? You can start moderating a discussion with Keith, Eliuth, and Sarah and I will chime in here and there.
Sounds great. And we'll cover the following question implicitly as we go through this. But just to start, Eliuth and Keith, you, as you know, are both at different points in your journey. Could you briefly, starting with Eliuth, tell us where you are, what year, what phase, in a nutshell?
Sure. We started here, as Nick noted, with kind of public serving spaces. So you can think about libraries, gyms, dining halls, and made the decision to expose that information for folks to plan their visits, right? It's kind of the busyness of those spaces that students kind of value and other community members to plan their trips. So that was kind of the initial use case a few years ago. And then, I didn't want to say the word COVID, but I will. Through COVID, certain guidelines and rules regarding social distancing prompted us to expand the program to open spaces. We enabled some classrooms, outdoor classrooms, and provided guidance for some traditional instruction spaces to ensure that we had some understanding about social distancing. So that was kind of the second phase that happened through COVID. And now, we're still, kind of recovering from the COVID hangover, and there's a lot of opportunities to calibrate and understand how our space are performing. Here at UC San Diego, we have the largest capital program in the nation, and we want to make sure that we're delivering the right living and learning spaces. And so having another tool in our space management, space planning, space strategist toolkit, was needed because we have a lot of good information, and our framework is pretty robust. We collect information about where people, sit, when they sit. So we have a good understanding of the self-reported piece. But really, when there are certain areas, certain spaces that seem to be underutilized, and so providing data in across campus to space managers, space decision makers, so they can understand really what's the right size for their team, was paramount, as we recover from COVID. And we've been able to use our space management framework along with live density data to really right size and be able to have those difficult conversations and ensure that we can prioritize and work with those different units, either to give them that information for them to recalibrate internally, or to have conversation across the portfolio on administrative space, right? So we have better understanding and make informed decisions. We know that space is a resource, and want to make
Right.
sure that we're good stewards of it. So that's kind of where we're at.
Gotcha. Well, and somebody had to mention the C word first, but COVID, but I think it's appropriate because it really is part, not just the event itself, but some of the things we learned during that time make this an opportune time, I think, to be talking about occupancy sensing and changes in how we do space. So thanks for taking one for the team there. And Keith, you are a little earlier in the journey, but tell us where you are.
Absolutely. So where they are at UCSD, they're probably the hare, and we're probably the tortoise in this conversation. So we've been at it for probably a year so far, and a year on the communication stream, just trying to determine where should we place the sensors in this environment. So for us, I could say going back to 2019 BC, before COVID, we were looking at our lease footprint here around the city of Richmond. We have two distinct campuses. I'm on the Monroe Park campus here, but about 2.3 miles away, there's a medical campus. Totally different environment, health sciences, the VCU health system as well too. So in that realm, we have a lot of lease spaces here within the city of Richmond. So our thought was, okay, are there opportunities for us to sort of vacate these spaces and kind of bring some of our folks back home just based upon utilization? That was our thought in 2019 BC. After that, it's a whole different conversation because we have so many people that are teleworking on either 100% or 1 day a week, or myself, I'm here 3 to 4 days a week. So how does that look for us here, and how do we approach that? And working with the provost office, our first thought was, okay, let's go and get these spaces, and that approach, it failed miserably on like day one. So we said, okay, let's recalibrate this. So think about this holistically. How can we make this happen? Just figuring out who is where. So in this weird kind of polite way, myself and a colleague of mine in the provost office, we were human sensors. We walk in and say, you know what? It's pretty dense here. Wow, it's dense. When we talk to the users, they're like, oh, you were there on a bad day. We weren't here that day. And that was the constant feel we would get from our end users. So we're thinking, okay, we need something that's more data driven to give us this answer. We'll start thinking broadly about sensors as well too. And so typically when we work on our capital projects, we do more of a one-to-one. There are 50 offices here for this particular school and group. Their new building, they'll get 50 offices. Using technology can help us sort of understand how often are they using these spaces going forward, so we can right size these projects for us going forward, and then use that other dynamic of square footage to really help what happens in the functionality of these spaces. So that's the approach we're taking right now in BCU, is that not to be the space bouncer per se, but think about the bigger picture of capital projects going forward, and also having those palliative type conversations with our colleagues here at the university.
Right. Okay. So let's keep it with you, Keith.
Mm-hmm.
It can be daunting to say we're going to take this step of becoming data centric. But I think one thing that we all like to emphasize is that you can start slow, experiment, fail, revise. And so let's talk about pilot locations. Did you pick any pilot locations? How did you choose them? And maybe what did you hope to learn from the pilots? And Elias, I'm going to ask you the same question so you can start to formulate.
Sure.
But Keith
So
first.
absolutely. So we're looking at three different, I would say, functionality types. Okay, so the one is the one I mentioned before, right? It was the human sensor approach. We know we need to figure out what's happening here, so we're going that direction. And we've been pretty transparent with this particular group about why we're doing it. But we express to this group as well, we want to help you right size your spaces going forward, because in this particular instance, these two groups are sharing a space. They're not happy anyway in their footprint in their space. So how can we find a better harmony for you based on how you guys function, whether you stay here, you have new roommates, or do we find some location to right size these locations? So when that became the talking point, not to say we're going to measure where you are, suddenly it sort of changed the entire conversation. We start thinking less about sensors, more about how we work. And that's the space we're trying to get to. How do you guys work, and how can we solve that problem? So that's number one. Number two, going back to my topic about capital projects. We just finished a capital project a few years ago, in which we moved several different departments and several different academic units and schools into one building, but we weren't complete. There's a phase two to that. And so that phase two, we want to really understand again how they function in their spaces. Academically, we're more into the hybrid learning, high flex environment now. What's the right size for that space going forward? It can't be that 100-seat auditorium next time, right? So what is that right size for that space? So we're going to use these sensors to tell us how to make that work and make that work better, and really engaging our faculty into this conversation. So they're driving the function and the form component of all that. And once we begin to share that story about the sensors and not this whole thing of, I want to know where you are, it suddenly changed. So we're trying to pilot certain things, Chris, on that level, at a very, very small level right now, to see where can it eventually take us here at VCU.
Thank you. And Elias, how about you? And if you had a bunch, you don't need to go through all, but what were some of the pilot locations and the logic behind them when you all started out?
Yeah, I think our biggest concern was administrative space, and really understand have a baseline of how space performs, in any given quarter, right? And so we started with administrative space across campus, and really with a focus to understand the baseline. We learned that different departments use space differently. We learned that there are buildings or square footage that it's kind of a touch point for people to come in and out. A lot of engineers, coming in and out of the building, and depending on the focus or the business need, each space performs differently. So one of the first kind of approaches was really, what do we need to learn from that space or that team, so we can right size the space. So it was more administrative. It was in light of some moves that needed to happen. So we calibrate the space, start those conversations, and really provide insights to the operational managers and leadership of how they perform with the live density, and incorporate that information to the framework. And I think at the beginning we were able to recover close to 20,000 ASF signable square feet from administrative space. But that was kind of the concept. How do we learn more about our own spaces and provide that information to operational leaders, so we can have those conversations?
Okay, thank you. So moving on to sort of another phase of this is who's on your team institutionally to start considering occupancy sensing, moving into the implementation. And I would say there are, at least three considerations when it comes to picking team members. One is transparency, the other is buy-in, and the third, gasp, is actually who would have good ideas. There may be four other ones as well. But Elias, not necessarily listing everybody you brought in, but who were some of the key players, and who were some of maybe the surprisingly useful or informative players on your team? And was there anybody who you didn't loop in that maybe you did later on or wish you had?
So I think my role is to support kind of the tools and processes to improve understanding for space management. Truly, the user of this information are the academic leaders, the administrative leaders. So we knew that there was a better way to understand our baseline, to really dive into our framework that we have, from self-reported information to visual observations, and needed that additional piece of information so we have a well-rounded picture of our space. So in many cases, the coalition, included folks in different. It's a cross-functional team, right? We need awareness, of course, and buy-in from leaders. We need subject matter experts for the space management framework, and we need to partner very closely with space planners on campus, along with a robust community engagement to articulate, what are the reasons and the scope of the program, what it is and what is not. So we have a common set of information, because there could be a lot of information that flows out there that may not be accurate. So having clean information, crisp information on the website about what the program does, how this is going to help the community overall. Having town halls with leadership, engaging directly with academic units, administrative, to understand really what are the concerns, if any, and to articulate why are we doing this. That ultimately is improve the way that we manage our space resources. That's not trivial.
Okay. And Keith, have you all, would you say, built your team out? And I want to ask another question, Keith. I'll make you answer it, but Ellie, if you can jump in too. When I did or do change management, I like to bring in, potential skeptics, or the people who might not be oriented towards this project. And as we know, just the gorilla in the room is some people do worry about space occupancy sensing, even though OccuSpace, as Nick mentioned, is very privacy centered. There are others that aren't. So it's a concern you'll sometimes hear, even if it's a very vocal minority. So do you bring in skeptics as well, or do you just bring in sort of the cheerleaders and the technical experts?
We have a wide tent here, Chris. We bring in everyone. So the skeptics, me personally, I love the skeptics to come to the room, to be a part of the table. I feel like you learn from them, especially their emotional mindset regarding space. I think it's very, very helpful. And at the same time, those in the room that are from the IT world as well, too. To me, those are the two most important people, because the IT is going to have to work to be successful. If it does not, then it's going to fail, regardless of what our intentions are going forward, right? So we lean heavily towards that end. But from a VCU standpoint, currently, is a very, very small subset of people. I work really close to the provost office. They know the right people to kind of be in the room. They know which schools are having the challenges when it comes to spaces. So we bring folks that are looking for solutions. They're looking for some ideas to go forward with. And so those are the people we really lean into to have these meetings. We've had meetings that are called triangulating space, mission, and meaning meetings. And we're bringing about maybe 8 people, a guest speaker, and very relaxed atmosphere. And we just have a conversation about how things are going in your space. The speaker would talk about, and this was the last iteration we had this last year, about teleworking in space and that type of thing. And then we don't know what's going to be our outcome, right? So when we begin to talk about this, and these are like deans, associate deans, our finance folks as well, too. I think they're important to this process, because when everything happens going forward, it has to be funded. So we want them to be a part of this as well. And not to our surprise, but it was like, everyone was kind of like, I can see what you guys are trying to do. I got an idea, and that's the first thing I'm looking for, is there an idea? And we can build upon that. So when I say it's taking us a year to get to where we are now, communication-wise, to a year to, hey, let's go forward, let's go with the product, to deciding where it's going to land. that's been our next really large step for us. Is to say, okay, we've identified these 4 locations. We feel really good about that, and we're going to really push this forward and see what our results are going to be for our team.
And this may come up later, but I've always thought that if you can't make the case for your project to some skeptics, then maybe you don't have the case for it. And I would say in occupancy sensing, what are you going to do? Make decisions with no data? And so in some ways, I welcome those skeptics. And Sarah and Nick, your mouth started to move, but I was going to ask Sarah. So you two, either or both of you, talk about maybe what you've seen in between Eliuth and Keith's experiences across your users.
Sarah, feel free to jump in.
Sure. Yeah, I was just. I think what both Keith and Eliuth have mentioned is accurate. I think that we've, of course, had on my end with the account management and implementation team have had a really close relationship with Eliuth and have experienced the communication that he has had with the broader university. And I just want to note that from our side, what you can expect from OccuSpace, and hopefully you would expect from other partners too if you end up using a different occupancy solution. But we're really there to join any and all of those communications. At UCSD, there was a town hall that Nick joined. We have our implementation team on campus. We're the ones that are there plugging the sensors in if needed, doing the head counts that are required as well. And we can act in 2 ways. We can act as a kind of separate vendor, just like any vendor that you would expect to see on campus, or we can be there really as a partner. At UCSD, we wear the UCSD shirt. And if that's helpful and necessary, we'll do that. We're often accompanied by an escort and really want to be there to be an extension of your team. I think that the other thing is just also know that we're there to help with the communications. We offer a very clear and concise plan of when and where we'll be on campus, and share that with Eliuth, and then he shares that out to the team. So I think that those are some ways that you can expect to see support from OccuSpace if and when you were to move forward.
Awesome. And before we jump into Allison's question here, I wanted to respond a little bit to what Keith was saying about bringing in some of the skeptics, and that honestly, it felt like there wasn't a ton of pushback when they really presented the plan. And that makes me think of kind of the big picture trends across office space and across the globe in this country. There's some good data on this in private corporations, less so in higher ed, but I think the trend is probably similarly true, where a recent report showed 90% of corporations in the Fortune 2000 are moving from assigned seating to desk sharing. And I think if you tried to do this 5 years ago, or even 2 or 3 years ago, there's going to be a lot more resistance. But now everybody knows the way we use the office space has changed. Everybody knows hybrid work is here to stay. And there's a lot more acceptance to change in the workplace versus 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and especially pre-COVID. And so I think these conversations are going to be easier and easier as time goes on, my guess is that almost nobody has an assigned desk in 5 years from today, except outside leaders in any organization. I think that's really going to be the norm. So I think these conversations are going to get easier and easier. And it's great to hear with you, Keith, that there wasn't a ton of pushback in your discussions.
If I could add one thing as well, too, Nick, as well, is that, at that point, we were trying to decide, and I say we as the provost office and our team was trying to find that mutual benefit. If you can find that mutual benefit for this process, that's going to get you down that road a much faster, or get you to second base faster, or third base faster, by finding that mutual benefit. It's just simply for us to say we want to know where people are. That's going to get you anywhere. I mean, honestly, it's not. To say that I want to save money on a lease, that's not going to get you there. But what's that mutual benefit for that other individual that may feel like they're going to be compromised or feel uncomfortable doing something? What are they going to get out of all this? And so if you lean into that particular end of it, I think it's going to go, not say easier, but it'll get you down that path.
And what was that mutual benefit that you guys talked about with the folks at VCU?
Yeah, so it varies. So the one group we're working with right now is that they're just really space challenged. There's a project on the horizon, maybe like 3 or 4 years from now, and they want to make sure that they get it right. They want to make sure they get the space right. And in this different environment, like providing the teaching for our students in this hybrid, high flex environment, they want to make sure that we don't go out and make this other 100 seat space for teaching that doesn't really meet the needs going forward in, say, the year 2030 or the year 2035. What does that look like? So our IT team is playing a really big role in technology, is like on what's out there, and speaking to our peers about this as well too. So is right-sizing technology, experience from our other peers, and also how our folks here function in their space. So they have an opportunity now on their end as a faculty member to say, you know what, I can actually like be a part of the design and the functionality of my classroom. And that gets them to that other acuity part for us going forward.
Yeah. Keith and Elliot, if I can, and actually for all of you, if I can just jump in, my experience in doing change management is that, and this goes to the communications, it goes to who's at the table. The people who are happy with the status quo will be the loudest. The people who may benefit may not be as self-aware. And that's a generalization, but I've found that to be true. So does that resonate with you all? And to me, that meant remembering that if you look at the universe of input, you're not hearing enough from the beneficiaries unless you really go out.
Yeah, I would say that, part of the journey, right, is engaging with the community and really listen and understand the concerns and build a program where you can be deliberate about the risks. There's no technology without risk. And having technical policy and even audit guardrails to ensure that if the program intends to provide, another measurable quantitative tool for space management, that scope gets enforced, that it's not used for other use cases, that we call out and emphasize, on the those guardrails. What are we doing? Who has access to what data and when? Having that information up front is part of change management. And to your point, I think is change management includes a feedback loop, not just what people need to know for a successful implementation, but what we need to know as program managers. So I think, again, that having that open and honest feedback loop to really understand, we hear that there is, a breach in major companies happen every day. Our data is compromised. So, I have young kids, and I'm as scared, for privacy as anybody else. So, it's kind of weighing in, the benefits and the risks. And I think that it's not just about, those that may not want to know about their space, but really there's honest privacy concerns. And I think that working on a program that deliberately publishes the information and who can access the information when, what technical guardrails, how are we protecting people's information and privacy? I think that's probably the biggest part of a program. And again, it is not trivial, but it's a journey, definitely. And I would say that for this and any other program that deals with people's location, even though there's very good technical guardrails, it's not bulletproof. But again, what technology is, right?
And Aluth, real quick, before I promise we'll get to Allison's question right next, but I'm curious of what Keith was mentioning, if you have an opinion on this mutual benefit with the space occupiers, people allocated to be in that space. I know we've talked about this a bit, but how are you thinking about that at UCSD? And is that kind of, I think that's gotten to be more and more in the conversation there around, potential hybrid work and not coming in, being flexible, and when people come in as being a part of that benefit. But wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of nuance there, but yeah, there's a clear benefit, right? Understanding space, having a strong space management framework that includes live density data, And I could see somebody that say, yeah, I'm all for that, but I'm also concerned about my privacy. So it's, again, there's a lot of nuance there. I think that overall, people want to be good stewards of our mutual, for resources. We're a public university. And also they're concerned about protecting the privacy of the people that we serve. So I think the benefit of the framework, is, can we use space more efficiently, and can we quantify how we're using this framework to improve outcomes in the way that we allocate and organize space. So I think that's one component. There's some value there, and the nuanced part is, it's not necessarily everyone that may have concerns is against this concept, but again, there's a lot of conversations that, as you know, Nick, we've had with the community, and it's been a learning experience for not only, the space side, but also programmatically, how do we make sure that we're protecting people's information in a way that again, it may not be 100% bulletproof, but we have the right information in front of people, and then we understand those risks, and people that may go into those spaces with sensors or no sensors. We used to have a team of people that used to go and count, people, and there was concerns about people going into other people, so just to count. So there's different ways to get that. I think the value is there on the space management side, and acknowledging that there may be people that continue to be concerned is, they're not mutually exclusive, right?
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay, so I think we're going to bring Allison's question up again, but in the meantime, I wanted to say that there's an ebook that covers some of these topics and more that will be sent out to all participants. And all attendees should feel free to reach out to anybody here after this broadcast. But Allison, who has, I assume, been patiently waiting, I don't know, she put her question in and wants to know, how long do you use sensors in a certain space before you feel you have good data? And I guess I'm going to just pick, that's my job, to not throw it out there and say everybody jump for the ball. But Sarah, do you, what's the answer to that question, and what's the variation depending on context?
Yeah. So generally speaking, we would say a year. It would be a good time to have the sensors in, so that you're seeing different seasonal changes, particularly within higher ed, right? If you're installing in June and only want to be have the sensors there for 3 months, that's the summer, and we all know what summer looks like at higher ed. And so seeing the change in the seasons and the way that people are using the space is why we would say roughly a year. We have implemented 3 to 4 month pilots with folks too, and we do find, particularly if you're within the semester, that makes a lot of sense, because you're seeing the kind of the start to the finish, right? And you're able to see the difference in the way the space is used throughout. So that would be our recommendation. Aluth, have you had a different realization based on your experience?
Different realization than what you described, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you feel like it's been better to have it for last or longer time.
I think that after the calibration period, and I think, after the 2 weeks, we do spot checks, and it's I think 2 weeks is a good time to have the sensors before turning it on for the dashboard. I think that having the sensors on while there's peak times, right? If you turn it on over the summer, there may be some additional calibration for the fall when a lot of people come back to campus. But it's been pretty accurate from from the time that they get installed, calibrated, and into the platform.
Thank you, Aluth, for reading that question better than I did. Sorry, Allison, I was thinking about just the space of time that you would need to have it in to make decisions about your data. And I see now that you were saying about before you feel have good data. So thank you, Aluth, for correcting me on that.
Okay. Although I have seen folks with plans to use the to use sensors for less than a year, which I always thought was peculiar, Sarah, to your point about an academic context. Although at the beginning, even if it's within a certain semester or a certain time, you can start to use that data. Perhaps it just, I think you'd want to leave it in to make sure that the fall doesn't look different than the spring, or exam week doesn't look different, at least in student spaces. Office spaces, perhaps there is less variation from May to August to December. But let's go with an anonymous question. What's the cost benefit? And I will ask, let's say, Keith, what do you imagine? We're going to say imagine. And Elliot, you're still doing some imagining as well. But Keith, you just jumped in. Tell us why, from a dollars and cents and cost benefit standpoint.
When we first went to this venture and thinking about sensors here at VCU, our cost benefit was several different factors. One was really like just resources on our end. I mentioned before about our capital projects here at VCU, just trying to right size these going forward. We have a project that's on board right now, and I think from an office standpoint, had we had some sort of data-driven exercise to go forward with that, we may reduce the footprint by like 50%. We can't do that now because it's on its way towards the planning construction side of things. So we want to make sure going forward, we just may find with the right size that on the back end, just to make sure we're in a good place. And again, I still go back to form and function and reaching out to our faculty and our administrators about these spaces, just to get it to a point where, yes, not only are they there in that space, they have some input as to how it's going to look and how it's going to feel beyond the standpoint of having four walls within the space. I think that cost benefit for us down the road is going to be tremendous for us in that end. On a much smaller scale, we're talking about just utilization itself in spaces. I think it's also important to know where we have folks in our footprint. I know for us here in space management, I was in the meeting this morning with my team. So we conduct space surveys every year, but the surveys open throughout the entire year. I've had like 230 plus people that conduct space surveys throughout the entire campus footprint, and that data all come back to my office. So I know where the departments are, which are offices and classrooms, where the people are located in those spaces. So I have a general idea of where people are. I don't know like the functionality or how often these places and spaces move within these people. So going back to that cost benefit on that end, that's what I'm trying to figure out more and dig deep into that data on the back end. Being a human sensor is okay, but I would rather go the other data-driven side as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll add a little bit on this. I can say, the cost of OccuSpace is usually going to be somewhere between 8 and 20 cents per square foot annually for space that we measure. That's going to be the cheapest solution on the market, the most privacy sensitive solution on the market, the solution with the least amount of sensors in the space. And so that's how we think about cost on a kind of square foot basis. And a lot of our customers are, if they're leasing space, they're spending $40-50 a year on their leases, let alone utilities and maintenance and office supplies. And if you're building space, you might be spending $1,000-2,000 a year per square foot on building new space. And so I think it's a pretty relatively small investment when you look at the kind of decisions that it can drive in terms of if Keith was able to build 50% less square footage of that building with this data, that would probably pay for the cost of OccuSpace for like 50 years. So on that one decision alone.
I would also add that, there's definitely costs that we can derive, right, if we've been able to improve the utilization of X number of square footage right through the space management process. But even the information that's been pushed out to kind of our decentralized units, the value of understanding their space so they can do their own calibration. I think there's we've always strived to have equity in how we organize space, and without having a baseline, at least to have those informed decisions, make quality space management decisions, I think that there's a qualitative value to understand space and ensure that each space manager, that each decision maker has access to that information. I think that there's a lot of value in the way that distributing space equitably across the different domains makes sense, and we can prioritize right according to our strategic plan in right size spaces by empowering people to access this information. So it's a little bit of both. There's the quantitative part that's really clear, and the qualitative that helps our community make more informed decisions.
Awesome. And I know we wanted to hit on communication and deployment a little bit. I think we might run short on time and go right into kind of decision making and some more questions here. But Eliuth, I know you guys have built a pretty great website for our project. If folks Google UCSD live density, they can find that website, and then maybe somebody could put it in the comments here. And that has a great FAQ, shows a lot of the communication that you guys have done on campus. So I think it's a great template for a lot of people to use as they think about rolling this out across their offices and campuses as well.
Yeah, so the communication, each journey, as Chris noted early, is different for each university. I think universities are complex organizations, and there's not a one size fits all. For us was to get a coalition of people to provide different perspectives and make sure that we are deliberate about the scope of the program, the risks, the technical policy guardrails, in front of everyone, and drive the value proposition about the magnitude, I guess, that space management and efficient space management plays in our overarching goals and how we align to them. And again, we're not trying to get 100% buy-in. We're trying to be transparent and protect people's information and our own space assets in a way that's balanced. And again, without being prescriptive, there's a different path for everyone. Engage with your privacy experts on your campus, engage with the different constituencies, so you have a more cohesive and robust change management and rollout plan that may not be for everyone, right?
Okay. Nick, did you want to follow up on that, or did we want to move a little more into the data discussion?
Yeah, I think we can move into the data discussion. Appreciate that background. The communication and rollout plan is so important to making sure these are successful. So thanks for sharing that. And we'll be sure to share the UCSD live density page as well.
Yeah, I agree, Nick. And that comms plan, and a lot of us don't think of ourselves as communications people, right? We're in some other line of work, but if you have to be able to have one, and you have to map it to your change goals. And in that sense, it's both a tall order, but also that can guide you in thinking about who you're going to talk to, how often. And to me, I think a key thing is remembering we're living and breathing these changes. The campus isn't. So the comms really, really does matter. But when it comes to data, I would start by saying this. It can be almost daunting to think, okay, we don't really do measurement of occupancy or space utilization on our campus, or we do it sort of sporadically as maybe new building proposals come up. And so what are we going to do? We need this perfect deductive plan to use all the data just so. And the other hand, it would say, no, just start, just start, just look around. And I'm wondering, Keith, what's your thought? Are you feeling good, feeling nervous, not feeling sure of that data that's going to start rolling in for you?
Yeah. Funny you asked that, Chris, because I was just talking with my colleague in the provost office. He's like, okay, we're about to get started. We're going to start getting data. Like on, what do you think? I'm thinking, well, it's going to be interesting, for us, because again, we're in this world all the time. So we thought about it and said, it's going to help us just, again, I use the word right size so often, but it's going to help us just right size first the conversation. With my design background, I want to hop into a piece of pad and start drawing it out, right? But it's going to really right-size the conversation for us going forward. And so that's the most important, what's the most interesting thing for me on my end is being able to have those dialogues with the faculty members, with the administrators, with the deans about these things. Because again, we live it and breathe it all the time. They only sort of hop into it when they have to, and usually they hop into it because they have to, and then we get out of it as soon as possible. So to come to them with a different kind of context, like, hey, we want to really engage you in this, and then hear their thoughts and ideas. And as you said, be able to listen more. I mean, I'm talking a lot today, but in these meetings, I'm listening and I'm just writing down notes, and that's all I'm doing is listening and writing down notes the entire time. And I just come back later on and say, hey, let's do coffee someplace. And we just talk about it. So I pull them out of that office environment, and it's somewhere we're having coffee, we're having lunch. I had lunch with someone recently along the phone with the provost office, and our thought was, okay, we could have this tough conversation about the sensors. We want to put them in their environment. He knows it, but this is the official talk. And so we had the conversation. It went from, gosh, not only was he on board, he's like, okay, so how do I tell my people we're going to do this? So that was a tremendous jump. That was that first to third move. You know what I mean? So we're like, okay, great. So on that end, Chris, yeah, it's just really trying to see what's going to happen next and do that more of that listening part of that conversation.
Sure. Okay, so with maybe 5-6 minutes left, Eliuth, I have two questions for you. I'm going to ask you one because you may answer them both without me asking them both, and then Sarah, maybe you can come in and speak sort of more globally. But Eliuth, you got some data, maybe multiple cycles. Can you give an example or two of how you've used it?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of clusters of administrative space where we needed to get a better understanding of, the performance of that space, and we're in the middle of a construction site that's building a flagship complex for kind of the gateway to the campus called the Triton Center. So that requires moving different groups around temporarily and some permanently. So leveraging couple of clusters of space to accommodate these moves has been incredibly helpful. It's helped with conversation across with leadership and at the department level. So again, it is time where we have 3 or 4 large projects that include multiple buildings, and having information on this cluster of administrative spaces has helped us really navigate through these transitions and be able to develop scenarios where we can move people at times to different spaces and really right size their space that we have to factor in not just their total number of FTEs, but when are they here on campus, the type of space that they need based on their particular roles. But again, this journey I don't think would have been possible without this piece of the space management framework in the context of displacements for construction that requires a multi-tier planning phases. Yeah.
Great. And Sarah, you want to the omniscient view of a cross school observation there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we think about it in 3 phases of how you're going to manage and improve the physical spaces. And I think, they can happen linearly, or they can happen at the same time, really. And so, Eliuth has mentioned this, Keith has mentioned this, it's the right sizing initially, right? It's getting the data, understanding how spaces are being used. And does that then help you to understand that you need to shed some leases, maybe you need to do some subleasing? We think about right sizing and sort of like larger decisions that need to be made, right? And then you may move into optimizing, which is potentially moving departments around. You have a department that says they need more space, data proves out that they do in fact need more space, and you have a department over here who is using their space, underutilizing their space, and so can you swap and or share, right? And then the third, again, these don't have to be linear, they could all happen at the same time, would be about in the engagement of that space. How are users flowing through the space? How are they aware of the availability of space? And that, I mean, as Nick mentioned, that's really the start of OccuSpace. Is it was the student space, the public space, and it was allowing people to know how available spaces were, right? And so how can you then turn that into the same within office spaces? We have a client who's really seriously thinking about displaying the data in real time so that their staff can plan their commutes. Are they going to come to the office or not that day based on how busy it was last Monday at this time, right? And so I think, again, it's those three real buckets: the right sizing, the optimizing, and the engagement. I think you've heard kind of that theme throughout today.
And I think one last thing I'll say, Nick, before I let you bring it home, is to editorialize a little bit. Is I've found when you're doing data, whether it's occupancy sensing or anything else, and this is something I thought a lot about when we were doing data visualization, is you get your insights, but you also, I found, it establishes you as not being capricious. You didn't wake up just to go take space from somebody. You're using data, you're being careful. And it also, if I can go here, say that some people are willing to make assertions if you don't come with data. But if you have data to show them, you at least create a conversation where you have to share facts. So that's been my experience, and maybe Nick, you can go from there and bring us home.
That's so true. Our data is a conversation starter. It's not by itself going to make space allocation decisions. There's a lot of other factors space planning teams will take into account when making these decisions, but it opens the conversation, and it's unbiased data that really allows a lot more effective communication with space planning folks and the departments occupying that space. But it's exciting to see these decision-making frameworks and the different ways folks are using the data. It's changing all the time, but I could talk about this all day long, but the hour's wrapping up here. So I want to thank Keith, Eliuth, Chris, Sarah. Thank you all for being on the panel today. I know I learned a lot from meeting with you guys, talking with you guys, and appreciate everybody else who joined. There's a lot of questions that I want to get to, and hopefully we can follow up. We will be following up with an ebook that talks about a step-by-step guide to rolling out occupancy data sensors across your campuses. And feel free to reach out to anybody here with any additional questions. We'd love to chat more. But hope everybody has a great end of the week. Thank you all for joining today.
Have you ever wondered how your office space is actually being used? If you knew, could you optimize or even reduce your real estate? Get to know OccuSpace, the only infinitely scalable, instantly deployable, privacy-first occupancy measuring solution that shows you what's going on so you can stop guessing and start knowing. This simple plug-and-play format requires zero infrastructure changes. Easily capture reliable data to optimize space allocation and design, improve employee experience, and reduce costly unused spaces. OccuSpace can measure utilization for a single office floor or across your entire real estate portfolio. Your data is always accessible. With a glance at your dashboard, through digital signage, or seamlessly integrated to any third-party platform via API. OccuSpace, the simplest, most cost-effective way to stop guessing and start knowing.